It's not about that Billie Jean. Billie Jean is kind of anonymous. It represents.
On June 25th, 2009, the world didn't just lose a superstar. It lost a myth that had been bleeding in silence for years. A man who once made stadiums shake with a single step was preparing to come back while privately living like a prisoner of his own legend. He owned the brightest spotlight in human history, yet he couldn't buy one ordinary night of peace. Not one. And that's the cruelest paradoxon of all. How can someone loved by billions still end up alone behind locked doors, chasing sleep like a ghost? How did Michael Jackson become the loneliest man on earth? By the early 1980s, Michael Jackson was no longer measured by charts, trophies, or ticket sales. He had crossed into a rarer territory, one where a single human being reshapes culture itself. When Thriller arrived, it didn't merely dominate the industry, it rewrote its rules. Music videos became events, dance became language, fashion became signal. Entire continents moved in sync to one man's timing. For a moment, the world felt smaller because it was all looking in the same direction. From the outside, this looked like the ultimate victory. Stadiums sold out in minutes. Broadcasts reached hundreds of millions. Applause followed him like weather. Unavoidable, overwhelming, constant. Michael didn't just perform on stages. He occupied the global imagination. Children copied his steps in schoolyards. Adults reorganized their nights around his premieres. Governments, brands, and media institutions all understood the same truth. When Michael Jackson appeared, everything else paused. But this level of adoration carries a hidden transformation. As fame expands, life contracts. Ordinary experiences, walking alone, trusting strangers, resting without interruption, begin to disappear. Michael's presence no longer belonged to him. It belonged to schedules, contracts, expectations, and crowds. Each appearance had to be bigger than the last. Each silence demanded explanation. Each change invited suspicion. The myth could never rest, because resting would reveal the man underneath. This is where the story quietly turns. At the precise moment Michael seemed to own the world began to own him back. Security replaced freedom. Hotels replaced homes. Silence became dangerous, because silence meant headlines would fill the gap. Fame stopped being a reward and became a responsibility, one that never ended. The public didn't just want songs, it wanted access, not just performances, but explanations, not just success, but perfection permanently. Neverland emerged during this era not as extravagance, but as intention. It was built to manufacture something Michael never had, a protected inner world where rules were softer and time could slow down. To outsiders, it looked whimsical. To Michael, it was defensive architecture, a boundary between the man and the machine built around him. Yet even this sanctuary could not stop the pressure. Cameras still waited. Rumors still traveled faster than facts. The spotlight still found its way through every gate. The contradiction hardened. The more beloved he became, the more isolated he felt. When millions project their hopes, fantasies, and fears onto one person, that person becomes unreachable. Conversations turn performative. Relationships become transactional. Trust erodes quietly, not from betrayal, but from uncertainty. Michael began to live inside the image created for him, while the human part searched for a place to breathe. This is the setting of our story, not a fall from obscurity, but a rise so extreme it bends inward. A man standing at the absolute peak of fame, discovering that the higher the crown, the heavier It presses down, and beneath the roar of the crowd, a quieter question starts to form. What happens when the world loves the symbol more than the person carrying it? Long before the world crowned Michael Jackson, he was a child whose life began on a schedule. At 5 years old, Michael didn't learn the rhythm of playground games. He learned the rhythm of rehearsal counts. His earliest memories weren't bedtime stories or quiet nights, but long hours under fluorescent lights, repeating the same movements until mistakes disappeared. Childhood, for him, was not a phase to be lived. It was an obstacle to be overcome. In the Jackson household, talent wasn't celebrated. It was demanded. Music functioned less like art and more like obligation. Praise arrived only after precision. Love felt conditional, measured by performance. Michael learned quickly that approval followed perfection and silence followed failure. That lesson etched itself deep into his identity. To be accepted, he had to be extraordinary. Anything less felt unsafe. As the youngest member of the Jackson 5, Michael carried a contradiction that would define his life. On stage, he commanded attention with a confidence that looked effortless. Off stage, he retreated into fear and compliance. He learned to read adults before learning to understand himself. He smiled when expected. He delivered when ordered. The world saw a prodigy. Michael felt like an employee trapped inside a child's body. Touring erased the remaining traces of normal growth. School became sporadic. Friendships became temporary. Privacy disappeared before it could even be understood. While other children tested boundaries, Michael learned to avoid them. While others discovered who they were through mistakes, Michael learned that mistakes came with consequences. His sense of self fused tightly with performance. If the show went well, he existed. If it didn't, he disappeared. This early conditioning produced brilliance, but it also planted a quiet fracture. When identity is built entirely on output, rest begins to feel like failure. Silence feels dangerous. Stillness feels like being left behind. Michael grew into adolescence without the emotional tools that come from ordinary development. No space to rebel safely, no chance to fail privately, no permission to be incomplete. He matured in public, but emotionally remained unprotected. As fame accelerated, that unprotected core hardened into isolation. Michael didn't know how to relate without a script. Trust became complicated. Vulnerability felt risky. The world rewarded him for being exceptional, not for being human. And so the child inside learned to hide, first behind songs, then behind personas, then behind entire worlds built to replace what was lost. This is the foundation of everything that followed. The insomnia, the obsession with control, the longing for innocence, the construction of Neverland. None of it appeared out of nowhere. It all traced back to a simple truth. Michael Jackson never had the chance to become a person before becoming a product. And when childhood is taken before it can finish its work, it doesn't disappear. It waits. It resurfaces later, in fragile places, in dangerous ways, asking to be seen at last. The question that carries us forward is not about talent or success. It's this: what happens to a child who learns too early that love must be earned and never learns how to rest once the applause stops? By the late 1970s, Michael Jackson faced a quiet crisis. He was famous, but not free, known, but not defined. Years of child stardom had made him recognizable, yet boxed him into an image he no longer controlled. To survive, Michael needed more than success. He needed authorship over his own identity. That urgency drove him into relentless work, obsessive refinement, and a pursuit of innovation that bordered on self-erasure. Off the Wall marked the first real escape attempt. It wasn't just an album. It was a declaration that Michael was no longer a child act. He studied rhythm like architecture, choreography like physics, and sound like emotion made tangible. He rehearsed not to impress, but to dominate the details others overlooked. Every breath, every pause, every movement was tested against an invisible standard that only he could see. This wasn't perfectionism for applause. It was perfectionism for control. Then came Thriller, and with it, a transformation so complete that it altered the definition of pop stardom. Michael fused music, film, and fashion into a single language. The stage became cinema. The music video became narrative. Performance became mythology. He wasn't merely releasing songs. He was designing experiences that lived inside people's memories. For the first time, he wasn't chasing approval. The world was chasing him. But building a myth requires total commitment. Michael worked through exhaustion, through injury, through nights that never truly ended. Rest felt irresponsible. Slowing down felt dangerous. The machine he had escaped from as a child had been replaced by a larger one, this time powered by his own ambition. Success no longer came from obedience. It came from outworking every competitor and every limit, including his own body. Breakthrough moments piled up, record-breaking tours, televised performances that froze time, a global audience that responded in unison. Yet each triumph tightened the expectations. Innovation became obligation. Reinvention became survival. The margin for error shrank until it disappeared entirely. The myth could not age, hesitate, or step aside. It had to remain exceptional or collapse. This was the paradox of Michael's ascent. In claiming creative control, he also assumed complete responsibility for maintaining the legend. There was no longer anyone else to blame, no boundary between the man and the work. When something succeeded, it validated his existence. When something failed, it threatened it. The distance between self-worth and performance narrowed to nothing. And slowly, the consequences emerged. Sleep became elusive. Pressure turned inward. The body carried what the mind refused to release. Fame no longer felt like expansion. It felt like containment. Michael had won his independence, but the price was constant vigilance against decline. By the time the global myth was fully formed, the man inside was already paying the interest. The world saw invincibility. Michael felt fragility. And in that gap, the seeds of collapse were quietly taking root. So as the legend solidified, another question began to surface beneath the applause. What happens when the person who builds the myth becomes trapped inside it? At the peak of his power, Michael Jackson appeared unstoppable. Tours expanded into moving cities. Albums didn't just sell, they set benchmarks others couldn't reach. Every reinvention confirmed the same message. The myth was alive and growing. Yet this was the stage of the story where triumph and damage became inseparable. Each victory arrived carrying a shadow, and each shadow lingered longer than the applause that created it. Fame, once an engine of momentum, began to behave like gravity. The higher Michael rose, the heavier everything felt. Public curiosity shifted from admiration to intrusion. Cameras multiplied. Rumors traveled faster than truth. Silence was interpreted as guilt. Visibility became risk. The world that had lifted him now demanded constant access, constant reassurance, constant novelty. The myth could not pause, not even to heal. Pressure manifested physically. Injuries accumulated from years of precision and strain. Pain, once occasional, became routine. Sleep, already fragile, nearly vanished. Nights stretched into cycles of exhaustion where the body refused rest and the mind replayed expectations without end. In this environment, relief didn't feel like indulgence. It felt like survival. Temporary solutions slowly hardened into dependencies, not out of recklessness, but out of desperation to function. Public perception shifted again. What had once been eccentricity turned into suspicion. Behavior that once passed as creative isolation was reframed as something darker. Headlines replaced nuance with certainty. Context evaporated. The human cost of relentless visibility was rarely discussed. It was easier to reduce complexity to scandal. The same system that had profited from Michael's myth now fed on its instability. Legal battles intensified the fracture. Courtrooms replaced stages. Testimony replaced music. For a man whose identity had always been fused with performance, this reversal was devastating. He wasn't proving artistry anymore. He was proving existence. Every gesture was analyzed, every word dissected. Even acquittal could not restore what scrutiny had stripped away, the presumption of innocence in the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, success never stopped demanding output. Tours had to be bigger. Appearances had to reassure investors and fans alike. Retreat was interpreted as weakness. Recovery was seen as delay. Michael was trapped between two equally punishing forces: the need to step back to survive and the demand to step forward to maintain the legend. Either choice carried consequences. Both exacted a toll. Isolation deepened in ways that money and security couldn't fix. Trust eroded, not because of a single betrayal, but because uncertainty became permanent. Relationships existed under a microscope. Motives blurred. Was affection genuine or proximity to power? This ambiguity made intimacy risky and loneliness familiar. Michael became surrounded, yet emotionally unreachable, protected, yet profoundly exposed. The tragedy of this phase is not that success disappeared, but that it continued. Every achievement postponed collapse while worsening the conditions that would cause it. The machine kept running because it could, not because it should, and Michael, conditioned since childhood to deliver regardless of cost, did what he had always done. He endured. But endurance has limits. Bodies signal before they break. Minds ask for mercy before they shut down. By the time the world sensed something was wrong, the damage had already layered itself year upon year. The crown still sparkled, the myth still stood. But inside, the space to breathe had narrowed to almost nothing. This is the cruel intersection where our story turns, not from success to failure, but from success to unsustainability, from admiration to extraction, from applause to expectation without end. And in that narrowing corridor, one final question begins to echo. How long can someone carry a legend when the legend no longer carries them back? Behind the spectacle, Michael Jackson lived a quieter, more fragile reality, one shaped by distance, distrust, and a lifelong hunger for unconditional connection. Fame had made him universally recognizable, but emotionally unreachable. Relationships for Michael were never simple. Every bond existed under pressure, filtered through suspicion, contracts, and the ever-present question of motive. Was affection real, or proximity to power? Love, when it appeared, arrived with constraints. Privacy was scarce. Ordinary rituals Dating without cameras, arguing without headlines, healing without commentary were nearly impossible. Intimacy required exposure, and exposure carried risk. Over time, caution replaced openness. The safest posture became emotional restraint. Michael learned to give generously, to care deeply, yet to hold parts of himself back, guarded against misinterpretation and betrayal. Neverland, often misunderstood, functioned as both refuge and mirror. It was designed to host innocence, to create a controlled environment where laughter felt predictable and safe. In that space, Michael could temporarily escape the adult calculus of power and scrutiny. But safety built on isolation has a cost. The more he withdrew, the narrower his world became. Sanctuary slowly blurred into seclusion. Companionship became curated. Loneliness grew not from absence, but from separation. Parenthood marked a genuine turning point. With his children, Michael found a form of connection that felt unmediated by expectation. Responsibility grounded him. Protection became purpose. For the first time, he oriented his life around something other than performance. Yet even this love unfolded under surveillance. Fatherhood, normally private and formative, was instead debated, judged, and politicized in public forums. The joy was real. The pressure was relentless. Trust remained the central struggle. Fame had taught Michael that visibility invites distortion. He weighed words carefully. He controlled environments meticulously. What outsiders interpreted as secrecy was often self-preservation. The cost of a misread moment could be catastrophic. Over time, this vigilance hardened into habit. Spontaneity felt unsafe. Silence felt strategic. The emotional labor required to simply exist grew exhausting. Despite immense generosity and empathy, Michael struggled to feel known. People approached the symbol before meeting the man. Conversations carried assumptions. Expectations preceded understanding. This imbalance eroded the reciprocity that sustains healthy relationships. Giving was easy. Receiving, especially without conditions, was not. And so, even surrounded by people, Michael often felt singularly alone. This phase of his life reveals a subtle truth. Isolation isn't always the absence of others. Sometimes it's the absence of safety in being seen as you are. Michael's longing was never for admiration. It was for normalcy, for a space where love didn't require explanation or defense. A place where he could rest without being interpreted. As the years progressed, the gap between the public myth and the private man widened. The more untouchable he appeared, the less reachable he felt, to others, and sometimes to himself. And that gap set the stage for the final chapter, where endurance met its limit and the cost of carrying a legend became impossible to ignore. In the final stretch of his life, Michael Jackson stood at a crossroads shaped by urgency and expectation. The planned comeback wasn't framed as a choice. It was framed as a reckoning, proof of relevance, redemption through performance. This is it, promised revival. But behind the rehearsals lived a man running on borrowed energy, chasing sleep that never arrived. The body moved because it had to. The mind pressed forward because it didn't know how to stop. Rehearsals revealed two truths at once. On stage, the precision remained. The instinct was intact. The myth still knew how to breathe. Off stage, exhaustion lingered in the margins. Thin patience, fragile focus, nights that stretched into morning without rest. Years of pressure had taught Michael to push through signals meant to warn. Endurance had become identity. Asking for relief felt like failure. When the end came, it landed not as spectacle, but as silence. The world froze, then erupted. Tributes poured in. Records surged. The same global system that had demanded proof of immortality now mourned its cost. For many, the shock was sudden. For others, it felt tragically inevitable. A life engineered for constant output had reached a point where recovery was no longer possible. Legacy, in the aftermath, became a battleground of meaning. Some focused on numbers, sales, awards, firsts. Others argued narratives shaped by scandal and rumor. But beyond debate lies a clearer truth. Michael Jackson changed how culture moves, watches, listens, and feels. He expanded the language of pop into a universal grammar. He proved that one artist could bend global attention into a single moment and hold it there. Yet his story also delivers a warning written between the notes. Fame, at its extreme, is not merely visibility. It is extraction. It takes time, privacy, rest, and sometimes identity itself. Michael's genius flourished because of relentless drive, but it was also diminished by the same force. The child who learned too early that love must be earned never fully learned how to stop earning it. What remains is not just a catalogue of songs, but a question we inherit as an audience. How do we celebrate brilliance without consuming the person behind it? How do we admire without demanding permanence? Michael Jackson's life asks us to consider the human cost of our myths and whether applause, unchecked, can become a kind of pressure no one is meant to survive. The spotlight eventually goes dark. What matters then is what we choose to remember and what we choose to do differently. The story of Michael Jackson does not end with a final note or a closing curtain. It lingers because it reflects something larger than one life. It exposes how modern fame works, how admiration can quietly turn into demand, and how a person can be celebrated to the point of erasure. Michael wasn't destroyed by obscurity. He was worn down by constant visibility. The world didn't stop asking, even when the body and mind were already answering enough. Media amplified the myth because myths attract attention. Audiences rewarded spectacle because spectacle feels infinite. And somewhere in between, the human being became negotiable. This is not a story about blame. It's a story about systems. Systems that monetize access. Systems that confuse curiosity with entitlement. Systems that confuse talent with availability. When those systems encounter a person trained since childhood to deliver at all costs, the outcome can be devastating. Michael's life challenges us to reconsider how we consume greatness. Applause is powerful, but it is not neutral. It shapes behavior. It sets expectations. It can trap people inside the very image we claim to love. The question is not whether legends should exist. The question is whether we allow them to be human while they do. What survives Michael Jackson is more than influence. It's a reminder that brilliance needs boundaries, that rest is not weakness, that privacy is not betrayal, and that no amount of talent can replace the basic human need for safety and sleep. If we remember only the spectacle, we miss the lesson. If we remember the person, we inherit responsibility. Fame will continue to see new kings, new icons, new myths. Whether they thrive or quietly break depends in part on what we choose to demand from them. Because behind every spotlight stands a person who eventually has to live without it.